Hello everyone, this is GM Josh Friedel, and I'm back with another addition to the Autopsy series. I do need to apologize to you guys for a bit. I've been pretty neglectful about this series. First I had a bad cough which lasted a few weeks, and then I've been actually working on another video project, which I'll tell you guys about when it's been done. So I've been doing that most days. But I figure I'm about to go on a trip, so to not do an autopsy video would be somewhat unfortunate. And I actually had a request to do one by Ben Johnson, who does a great podcast every week, the Perpetual Chess Podcast. If you guys haven't tuned in, I definitely recommend tuning into that one. He always asks some good questions, and he has some great guests on there. And he requested to do this game from Gibraltar, and this game was between white was Hikaru Nakamura, and black was Nakamura-Iturrizaga, who's a very strong Venezuelan GM. And this was quite a nice victory by Hikaru, but of course, because it's an autopsy, I'm doing it from the point of view of the opponent and how he lost and what kind of went wrong. So I really wanted to start with this game. It was a really nice game, and if you guys haven't followed the Gibraltar Chess Festival, I definitely recommend doing it. It was a really interesting tournament. The last round had lots of surprises with two really high caliber GMs, Maxime Weicher-Lagrave and Levan Orlean, both losing. So it was, a really fun tournament to follow in general, and this game was really nice. I would say that Hikaru lately, he's been playing more solidly, which is obviously a nice goal for people, but he's been actually drawing a lot more than he's ever drawn before. I think he's still trying to figure things out, at least that's my impression. But this event, he definitely got a few nice wins in, including this one. But we're going to see what kind of went wrong from Eduardo's point of view, who's, again, obviously lower rated in this matchup, but a really dangerous player, very strong. So he was black in this, and they actually play an opening I have some familiarity with. Queen's Indian. And again, I don't focus on the opening too much, mainly because that can take a lot of time. And this isn't really about opening discussions, but I've played this opening quite a few times from the black pieces, so this game definitely caught my eye. Rook e1, which is one of the topical moves. The others, d5 is a pawn sack that's been around for a long time with the idea that after you take, there's knight here, and the game becomes extremely sharp. There's other knight c3 is the old main move, and then black plays here, taking advantage of the fact that even though there's a potential pin on the long diagonal, knight takes c3 hits the queen. So it's kind of convenient, and usually white plays here, and then black can either play f5, or the more modern move is bishop f6, targeting the center a little bit and playing more solidly, usually with d6, knight d7. So this is kind of standard. Rook e1 is kind of a clever move, basically saying you don't really want to play knight e4 without a knight on c3. And I'm still going to support this, and I actually am not sure what you want to play here. So Eduardo actually chooses a rather unusual move. He plays queen c8. So d5, for example, is, you call it the main move, as in, the most logical. Like if you were just looking at this position, playing it in a blitz game, this would probably be your move. The drawback to this is that it allows white to define the structure, put the bishop on f4, so you get some position like this. And again, you could argue it's a little more comfortable for white, but it's just very normal. What's become the main move, as far as in modern play, and it's the move I've played before myself, which is knight a6. The idea being, this knight is often good there in the d5 structures anyway, or at least isn't bad, and it kind of waits for white to commit. So for example, if knight c3, now you can play this move. And white has definite options. White can play with knight e5, white can still play with bishop d2 type moves. There are lots of ways to play this position, and I don't really want to get too much into it. But Eduardo chooses queen c8, which is generally a useful move. You defend your bishop, and again, you're kind of like rook e1, it's a little bit of a waiting move. So white plays knight c3, allows knight e4, and now bishop f4. This is a type of setup which I actually think is playable against knight a6 too, and to my mind is really underestimated. And the reason why is because it puts a decision on black where to put the pieces, and that's not always such an easy decision to make. Because You'd like to often play with d5, but that looks weird against the bishop on d4, f4. So you can play d6, but that can be a little bit more passive. And it threatens to just play rook c1 and say, look, I'm just improving my pieces. What exactly are you doing with your life? And this kind of move, I think, is underestimated and often underused. So it's definitely a move which I can get behind. And I just know from my experience as black that this kind of move can be very hard to face. So I actually thought if I were playing black here, I'd probably just play d6, kind of keep the status quo, because I'm not exactly sure what white should be doing. So white can play rook c1 or queen out, but I can just play knight d7 if you don't threaten anything. You can take here, of course, but you're not really accomplishing too much. And my queen's ready to go to b7, the knight can go to d7. I don't think that it's all that... nothing too scary has happened yet, but Eduardo decides to create a structure change immediately. So this is always a big decision to take on c3. One of the benefits of Eduardo's play is that because the knight's not on a6, let me show you actually, because this is a very common occurrence in this line. If you play knight a6 and are facing this line, you can still take on c3 many a time, but the drawback to this move is that, let's say you do this and play bishop e4, which is what happened in this game, this knight on a6 is horrible. And oftentimes it'll end up just going back to b8 anyway, because the pawns really counter this knight, and the weak pawn in white's position, the c4 pawn, is almost impossible to target. So not that this is unplayable for black, but this knight on a6 definitely looks pretty rotten. So what Eduardo does is actually quite clever, which is he gets the same position, except he's played queen c7 instead of knight a6. Or queen c8, sorry, instead of knight a6. And I think this is of great benefit to him. However, I would argue that it's really hard to accomplish preventing e4. And this actually ties into how he lost the game, in my opinion. Something's kind of basic. That basically his idea was, I'm going to prevent e4 or discourage e4 at all costs. And this kind of mindset actually affected him in this game. So, just to give you an example, I don't think allowing e4 is the end of the world. Let's say you play d6, e4. Now, you can play knight c6 to a5, but in general, it's hard to target that pawn. But let's even say you go here. White has the center. This is very true. But it's not actually so easy for white to do anything here. If you move this e-knight, you have to all of a sudden contend with e5 type moves, maybe followed by c5, and black's fighting against the center. If you just play queen d3 and rook moves, that's nice, but you're not really doing anything. So it's a pretty solid position for black. It can be a little passive. Sometimes you end up playing rook e8 or bishop f6 or even bishop f8 and you just kind of chill. But at the same time, it's really difficult for white to do a ton. So oftentimes white will even play like queen out and h4 even, and it's not really in everyone's taste to play this kind of position as black. But I think that when you play a move like knight e4 and you take on c3 in particular, you're kind of signing up for it in some ways. But Eduardo had different ideas. He played bishop e4, which by itself was a very standard move, with the idea that you're preventing the e-pawn push by simply plunking a bishop there. And you're never really afraid of this, because first of all, this bishop on f4, I actually think it can be really misplaced here. But also, just in general, the idea of once you exchange the bishops, giving black this pawn center is a lot less risky. So even if you just go for a similar type of setup, and I'm not saying this is even the clearly best way to do it, it's a lot less dangerous than with the bishops on the board. It's still possible that white can be better in these positions, but it's usually much more challenging. So this is what I do. I say I'm not going to talk about the opening too much, and then I discuss the opening strategy. In my own defense, though, I actually think that this is part of how black got into trouble, because Hikaru played a very typical move for these structures. If you've never seen these structures before, a move like bishop f1 is going to appear completely mystifying to you. But the idea is you want to play knight f1 e4, or knight d2 e4. I keep saying the wrong pieces today for some reason. But you don't want to exchange the bishops in the process. So this is actually a very typical move. And one of the problems that black has here is that there's no really great way to deal with this. You don't, like, moves like f5 are extremely committal and don't necessarily stop the plan anyway. d5 is even more committal. It often trades off the doubled pawns. It makes the bishop on f4 stronger. These are just not really moves you want to play. So Eduardo actually came up with a very awkward-looking move, which I'm not really a huge fan of, simply because I think that ultimately it doesn't benefit him too much. Once again, I would probably just play d6, and after knight d2 say, too good, buddy, and allow e4. Again, it's not easy to play this way, but whatever. You play knight d7, maybe e5 comes, maybe e5, c5. You have so many ways to play this position, and again, it's a little bit passive sometimes. It's definitely not, you wouldn't call it a completely ideal position, but at the same time, it's not so easy for white to just crash through here, despite this huge-looking center. But I would say that almost certainly white's a little bit better, and black's going to have to play kind of from behind a little bit. But I think that what ultimately led to Eduardo's loss in this game was his stubborn refusal to allow this. And because he was too ambitious almost. He wanted so much from his position that I think ultimately it ended up just costing him the game, because by the time he maybe realized things weren't going so well, his position was already in ruins pretty much. And that's not to discredit Hikaru. He played some really nice moves to make it this way. But I think that a lot of the damage to the position was black's own refusal to kind of admit, okay, I'm a little worse, I misplayed the opening a tiny bit, maybe queen c8 is a little funky, maybe I shouldn't take on c3, whatever you want to say. But basically that, okay, I misplayed it, I'm going to be a little worse, and I'm just going to settle. And it's important sometimes to be able to have this attitude of, oh, look, I made a mistake, I'm going back, it happens. But he didn't do this. He played bishop d6, which by itself is not such a horrible looking move, because white really doesn't want to take. If you take, then this c-pawn actually does become targetable, and it just gives black boatloads of counterplay on this c-file. So taking is not really in the question, and white doesn't really want to allow takes g-takes, because then there's always the king to worry about, and there's no reason to weaken your king if you don't have to. But Hikaru simply goes back. And you could argue that bishop d6, bishop c1 favored white, but I honestly wouldn't agree with you. I actually think this bishop on d6 is clearly worse than e7. And the bishop on f4 is only really good if d5 gets played. Like, if black plays d6, that bishop often actually is in the way and can get stuck. There are times when you can even, dream of hitting the bishop with g5 if the knight moves. This is obviously a risky way to play. But sometimes that bishop it has to move anyway. So the fact that it went to c1, it's not doing anything great there, but it's certainly out of the way. So, again, while I don't think bishop d6 is such a horrible move, maybe it's not even a mistake, it's a step in the wrong direction. And this is where he really seals his fate, in my opinion. I really think he's got to go back now and say, look, I'm going to allow this, as I said. d6, knight d6. Again, it's not easy to play this way, especially when you're really trying to fight for equality. But sometimes you have to give up on equality. It's just not there. And I think that if black would have done this, they would have spared himself a lot of grief, because he played c5. Hikaru responded accurately with the move d5. And now all of a sudden you have all sorts of problems, because white has the center now. Like, if you allow e4, e5, you can just get completely destroyed. Whereas when you have the pawn on d6, you have things a little bit nicer. That's not necessarily the case. And in this place, already black has to make really tough choices. So again, this is where I think that mistakes on these moves are ones which often people assign for their loss, whereas oftentimes it was a poor way of thinking earlier, and you put yourself in a situation where to make accurate moves is largely impossible. And I think that's kind of what happened here, because to play this accurately as black, I have no idea what black should be doing here, honestly. e5 is a move which is so hard to play, because now your bishop at d6 just looks ridiculous. And you could still get overrun in the center, but there are arguments for this move, mainly that you're just trying to keep the game closed. If you open up the position, white's just going to overrun you, would be the theory. But to play a move like this is really difficult. You could play bishop e7, which is kind of what I wanted to do. Pretty much every move, I wanted to move my bishop. And then after knight d2, e4, maybe you can try to play with d6 someday. Maybe you can do something like that. But ultimately, it's a rough position. But this was definitely an option. He took on d5, which has some drawbacks, but it's also understandable. He wants to get counterplay someday. He wants to open up the game a little bit. But the problem with this is that if you don't play accurately now, you're just going to die. And really, that's kind of what happens. So, bishop e7 I still like, with the basic idea that if c4 now, for example, you can play bishop f6, and At least you're slightly embarrassing your opponent. I don't even know if you always want to take this rook, to be honest. But you're at least preventing the bishop from going to the long diagonal, which will kill you. So probably white would play a move like knight g5, and now you can play bishop g6 and allow e4. Personally, I would find this very difficult to do because I think that f4 is coming. I mean, this is... Like, for example, you can play h6, but the knight will even go back here. f4 is... I mean, it's just going to be devastating, I think. So personally, I would snap that guy off. At least put the bishop on a square where it's a little weird. And then in this position, you have different choices. I might stick to the straightforward, which is just to play here in d6 and basically say, alright, my knight's coming out to d7, I'm at least getting counterplay. Note how tactics are important. If you try to play this right away, which is the most natural move, you run into, most accurate is f3 to get the bishop off the d-pawn, and then bishop here, and you're going to lose an important pawn. So queen b7 first, and then d6. You also have other options here, I don't want to say that's it, but it's still a really tough position. So I don't really blame him. He wanted to be, again, a little bit more ambitious with the move rook e8. I don't think rook e8 by itself is such a horrible move. But his next move I really didn't like, c4, and here I think it was important to essentially, again, admit your worst. Basically say, look, I'm going to take this knight. I understand you don't necessarily want to play against those bishops, but okay. Bishop e5, take away the long diagonal from white, which is very important, and then play d6. And in this position, okay, definitely I would take white here any day, twice on Sunday. The majority here is never moving. And you're going to have to deal with these two bishops. Your light squares are going to be iffy. You're still not fully developed. However, nothing horrible is happening to you right away. You have no huge weaknesses. And you only need a few moves to get your pieces out. And eventually you might be able to get counterplay with b5. Again, this is eventually. For a long time, it's going to be almost impossible. Now, you know, and you're probably going to get attacked. But at the moment, nothing horrible is happening to you. But again, I think that it's really hard for people to do this, where you always want to be doing active stuff yourself. You always want to be trying to trouble your opponent in way, you know, keep the game double-edged, give yourself chances. But I think that when your position is kind of, I hate to say it, garbage, when your position has lots of problems, it's very important to play with that slight caution and, you know, not be too ambitious. Because again, if you try to be ambitious in a position where things aren't going your way, you can find yourself on the losing side very quickly. And that's kind of what happened. He played queen a6. And here Hikaru played a really, really nice idea. He played knight d2. So again, the bishop can move back, but then you have to deal with the bishop coming to d2, or even just e4. So for example here, even just e4 is going to be pretty strong. Sometimes moves like f4 even have their place because they make it so the bishop can't go to e5, and then bishop b2, and then e4. It's going to be bad, for sure. So his idea was to play bishop e5, but now Hikaru simply takes and then plays knight d6. So the idea, of course, is that black's taken in exchange. You'd think, well, this has to be better than those other lines where you're just passive. But that's not necessarily the case. This is an example of a position where objectively I think white is quite a bit better, but I think practically speaking it's almost lost because you can't develop any of your pieces. You're playing without a knight, you're playing without a rook, you're essentially playing without a queen. So to play a position like this accurately I think is nearly impossible with the black pieces. And in some ways that makes it even worse than lines where you don't have all that counterplay, but you're at least not getting crushed by the center. So he played rook f8. There's no real better square. e4. And honestly, now we can only kind of admire how Hikaru plays it. Maybe black should try taking this pawn just because I don't know what else you're going to do. You're at least improving your queen. Your knight can maybe get out. I would have at least maybe given it a try. He tried bishop e5, which looks very natural, trying to shoo the knight away. But the problem now is Hikaru simply plays bishop f4, and you don't really want to take. Even though normally this is not a bad trade for you, with the knight sitting on d6, you just can do absolutely nothing. And in the meantime, you're just going to get overrun by the center. White can play rook e3 to g3. The white king is not the weak one, ever. And honestly, I mean, you just have no prospects here. He tried taking the knight to get rid of that pesky guy. But the problem now is he loses even more time with the rook. And this bishop is so cemented, like, you can't ever get rid of it. You can't argue the rooks are better pieces here. And honestly, at this point, I think it was just mostly over. He took on a2. You could play you can win in lots of ways. Hikaru decides to go for the direct attack, which I like. Rook g4, and now as a black, you're basically a spectator in your own game. You're just sitting and like, I wonder how he's going to checkmate me. So again, I mean, you know, you can argue, you know, these moves he could have resisted more, but honestly, it's almost impossible, and even the computer will tell you that black is facing an impossible task. And for a human being, it's doubly impossible. So again, I mean, it didn't take that much, and when you're playing a player as strong as Hikaru, obviously, you're not going to have that many mistakes that you can make and survive. But I think that a large part of the error was actually how he approached it. So again, we can finish the game quickly before I summarize. I usually try to do that, but sometimes I forget. So yeah, this is a nice move. Of course, if rook takes e5, you're not going to capture the rook. You're going to play queen f6 and take a free rook. So that would be quite bad. There might be other winning moves too. So it's one of those positions where everything kind of loses. So he plays very simply though. He plays h4. So if you allow h5, h6, you're pretty much dead. He played h5 himself. And now Hikaru doesn't bother taking a rook, which is just sitting there. He plays g4, and Eduardo resigns, because if you take, you allow h5 anyway, your king gets destroyed if you let white take. The problem is you have no counterplay. Like a5, a4, a3 is about 20 zillion tempi too slow, so once you allow takes in h6, it's over. So again, it was a very nice game by Hikaru. And it's easy to point a finger, like, how could you allow yourself to just be on the back side of this attack? But as we saw, it wasn't that many mistakes that Eduardo made. But I think the main problem was that his view of the position was just not quite accurate. Like, he was trying to prevent e4, but basically he had to give up on this. He had to say, look, you're going to get your pawn there. I can't do anything about it. You know, unless I want to take on f3, which obviously had other drawbacks. So he should have, I think, gone back, played d6, knight d7. As I pointed out, he actually is slightly up on those other lines. And even those lines, I think, it's a little bit better for white. It's not crushing. So while I think he'd be a little worse there, I would take white if I had a choice, even though I play Queen's Indian. I think that it's just not... You know, you have to sometimes accept that you're going to be a little worse and just play the position that you have. The problem is that he didn't do that, and as you saw, his attempts to play actively, bishop d6, c5, queen a6, all of them essentially just got slapped in the face. Like, you just can't play this way when your position doesn't allow you to. So I think that this was a really good example of that. In any case, guys, I'm going to be away for a little bit, but I'm definitely going to really try to get this back on track once I have more free time, once I'm not doing other videos and all of this. But I hope you guys enjoy this coverage, especially you, Ben. I hope that you appreciated the game. I should say happy birthday to you also, so you could view this as my birthday present to you. But in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed the game. Even though you were facing it, you were seeing it from the black perspective. And I'll catch you guys around.